excited to introduce our speaker for this evening. Patrick Everitt is an independent researcher of Western esotericism. He completed the Master's in Western Esotericism here at the UVA, where his thesis was about Aleister Crowley's use of peyote for ceremonial magic. His primary research interest is the intersection of religious experience, esoteric, entheogenic practices, and naturalistic philosophy in the works of Aleister Crowley, Robert Anton Wilson, and Terence McKenna. He's presented at various conferences, both psychedelic conferences as well as about esotericism, including the ICPR, the Interdisciplinary Conference on Psychedelic Research, this past summer here in Harlem, which is where I was introduced to a version of this work, I think, which I thought was really very fascinating. So I hope you all enjoy it as well. So Patrick, I'll pass the floor to you.
Thank you very
so
much. Thanks, Emily. Thank you very much. Can you hear me at the back? It's all good? Okay. You can hear me? Can you understand me? I have an Irish accent. Yeah, okay. So thank you, APRA, for inviting me, and especially Emily. Thanks for helping organize everything, because it was super smooth. It was awesome. Thanks also to Aidan for talking to me about some ideas related to this. That was really great. I use a lot of quotations from Terence McKenna. I'm going to have them on the screen. You don't have to worry about paying too much attention to the words. I'm going to read it out loud, but he's a very wordy guy. The way he speaks is very important, so I wanted to include as much quotations from his talks as possible. There's a great website called asktmk.com, which I use a lot for getting these things. So I'd like to just say thank you to Jonathan, who runs that site, because he's done a great service. I'll say a little bit about who I am, because it looks like Terence is looking at my name going, who the hell is this guy? So when I finished school, I went to university and I studied software engineering in Dublin. And I got interested in cryptography, so I did a master's in computer security. And in the 5 years I was studying computer science, the most interesting thing I encountered was psychedelic plants, which were on sale legally in Dublin at the time, which was a fantastic thing for an 18-year-old to discover. Now, I know there's a lot of talk about whether there's value in a university education, but I can attest to the value of a university education and psychedelics at the same time. After that, I didn't really want to get into software engineering, so I went back to university as a mature student and I studied philosophy and classics at Maynooth University. Then I went to do a master's in philosophy, but didn't finish the dissertation because I wanted to switch to Western esotericism and focus on Aleister Crowley's work. So I came to UVA, I did my master's, and since then, I've been doing more research on Aleister Crowley, but also Terence McKenna, Tim Leary, Robert Anton Wilson. Just who here knows who Terence McKenna is? I'm guessing, okay. Who here would consider themselves a fan of Terence McKenna's work? Awesome, okay, that's great, that's good to know. So what I would like is a couple of things. I'm hoping to, maybe the people who know McKenna maybe will get a new way of kind of looking at the way he talks. People who don't know McKenna, I hope some people get interested and start listening to McKenna, because given the kind of stuff that people listen to these days, I think listening to McKenna might be a nice antidote for that. And also to basically legitimate McKenna as a subject of academic study with regard to his ideas, his philosophical ideas about psychedelics and language and evolution. So let's get into it. I'll explain a little bit of the terminology that I'm going to use. Western esotericism. When I tell people I have a master's in Western esotericism, get a lot of puzzled faces, people asking, what kind of terrorism is that? Intellectual terrorism maybe, but other than that. So there's a few ways that people categorize or define Western esotericism. Basically, it's an academic category in religious studies and history studies and cultural studies for the mystical and magical traditions of the West. Proposed definitions include the idea of a perennial hidden tradition or an enchanted worldview that's a reaction to an increasingly mechanistic worldview, or that it's about rejected knowledge, forms of knowledge that were rejected from the academy, for either being pagan superstitions or paganism that the church didn't like, so it was rejected as a field of study, or superstition that the modern scientific worldview didn't like, so it was rejected as a field of study. And also this idea of higher knowledge. I think all of these definitions tell us something interesting about Western esotericism. The main characteristics are, there's typically this idea that in all religions, there's one secret universal truth. And part of that is that the universe is a living, interconnected being or organism almost. And they are typically rejected, they're marginalized. There's a lot of social, cultural tension around esoteric traditions because they place an emphasis on direct individual experience, which is a serious problem for authority. And this idea of higher knowledge, which is sometimes called gnosis, or as they say in the Netherlands, gnosis. And gnosis means a directly experienced type of knowledge. It's not like propositional knowledge, it's an experience that transforms a person. So these are the characteristics of Western esotericism typically. I really like this definition. Western forms of spirituality that stress the importance of the individual effort to gain spiritual knowledge or gnosis, whereby man is confronted with the divine aspect of existence. So that's a nice definition, I think, and that's a fantastic book if anyone's interested in Western esotericism and initiation rituals. By the way, when I show quotes from McKenna, I don't say where they're from. If there's a particular one you want to know where it's from, come ask me afterwards, I can tell you where it's from. So here's some Western esoteric currents: Neoplatonism, Hermeticism, Gnosticism, Kabbalah, alchemy, Freemasonry, ceremonial magic, Tarot, Rosicrucianism, spiritualism, occultism, neo-paganism, the New Age movement, and entheogenic esotericism. This I will talk more about. But all of these traditions have those characteristics that I just mentioned. And if you're familiar with these, you'll know that these are typically fringe, marginalized traditions. They exist often in a state of tension with authority or exoteric forms of religion. Now, I'm also going to talk about some ideas from Aidan Lyon's book, Psychedelic Experience Revealing the Mind. If anyone hasn't read this, it's a fantastic work of philosophy. It's got some really brilliant ideas about psychedelic experiences and how they can be conceptualized. I actually think it's one of the best books that's been written on psychedelics, and I promise I would say that even if Aidan wasn't sitting right there. So one of the things that Aidan suggests is that we can consider psychedelic experiences as mind-revealing experiences. And what's interesting about this definition is this means that it could be any type of mind-revealing experience, not necessarily one induced by a psychedelic drug. So he talks about psychedelic-induced experiences, but also meditation-induced mind-revealing experiences. So it's a very interesting way of characterizing psychedelic experience. So I will come back to this notion of mind-revealing. And also he talks about psychedelic space. Lyon outlines this notion of like 4 dimensions that we can talk about with respect to a psychedelic experience. That it has scope, clarity, novelty, and duration. So scope refers to the degree to which the experience reveals the mind. So the more scope, the more of the mind that's revealed. Clarity is how clearly those aspects of the mind are revealed. Novelty refers to the parts of the mind that are more deeply buried. He uses the term deeply buried in the unconscious. So, because the more surprising or more not as readily accessible contents of the mind. And duration is like the length of time that this revelation takes place. And then there's this notion of psychedelic philosophy, which is really interesting. Psychedelic philosophy puts an emphasis on methods that unlock the power of our unconscious thought processes. In other words, methods that the individual can use to reveal to themselves more of their mind. That this could be a philosophical method that we can use this meditation and psychedelic drugs to explore consciousness subjectively. But also philosophically, we use the analytic philosophical methods as a way of keeping in check the insights that we have, because these insights are not necessarily perfectly reliable. I'm sure anyone here who's taken a psychedelic has had the experience of being absolutely certain about something and discovering that it was not necessarily true. And so this is a really interesting way of doing philosophy. So again, I'm going to come back to this notion of psychedelic philosophy because I want to talk about McKenna as essentially a psychedelic philosopher, a guy who's exploring his consciousness and reflecting on it and using rational methods of analysis to do this. And then there's also this, what I mentioned, entheogenic esotericism, which is a category Wouter Hanegraaff proposed, the idea of the religious use of psychoactive substances as a means of access to spiritual insights about the true nature of reality. And these entheogenic esotericists, they put this radical focus on ecstatic gnosis, this transformative experience, which imparts like a higher knowledge, let's say. And this word entheogen kind of has its roots in the idea of generating the divine within. I think it makes sense to kind of associate this idea of psychedelics and the ecstatic gnosis that's in esotericism, because psychedelics, as studies have shown, reliably generate religious experiences, and they do produce these long-lasting spiritual transformations, and they have ancient religious associations anyway. And there's also the idea of endogenous psychedelic compounds, that potentially there are psychedelic compounds created in the human organism itself, which could explain spontaneous visions and spontaneous mystical experiences and so on. So I'm not proposing that that's the case. I'm just saying it makes sense that Hanegraaff has kind of linked these two things in this way. So if anyone is interested in like, and sorry, also I should point out, when I'm talking about these people that I'm talking about, Leary, McKenna, Wilson, the reason I'm talking about them and referring to their work is they're very explicit about this. There's lots of people, or there's lots of work that may be veiled references to psychedelic experiences and psychedelic practices, but these guys are explicit. And so that's why I'm focusing on them. So these are some great books if you're interested in this. These two here are kind of theoretical in a sense. I mean, theoretical and practical. These two here are sort of autobiographical. So this is like sort of tells you how to do it and what to do. And these are two accounts of people who did it. And they are hilariously weird. So if anyone is into McKenna and hasn't read True Hallucinations or hasn't listened to the audiobook, I strongly recommend it. It's brilliant. So I also want to draw attention to what we might call two categories of religious experience. What's sometimes called the unitive or mystical experience, which is said to be like void of contents. It's kind of characterized by the division or the distinction between subject and object being transcended. And that's not the only category of religious experience. There's also a relational type, sometimes called a prophetic experience or a visionary experience, where it's not that the subject and object division is transcended. That division, that dualism is retained, but the subject actually encounters some transcendent thing as its object. And so contrast, for example, like Buddha, this internal awakening versus Moses and the burning bush, right? I mean, these are very important historical religious experiences, but of a very different character. And again, I will come back to this. And I think what's kind of interesting about these two things is these two categories of experience tend to be associated very strongly with these two types of DMT. 5-MeO DMT seems to quite reliably induce these unitive mystical experiences, which are void of content, whereas N N-DMT seems to be quite reliable at producing these relational visionary experiences where the subject encounters something transcendently weird. And this was a problem for Rick Strassman when he began his DMT research in the 1990s, because Strassman expected his subjects to basically have something like a mystical experience, a unitive experience. But that's not what happened. And it became very confusing for him and the subjects. He was a Zen Buddhist at the time, and this was not what they were prepared for. He says that the highly articulated contents of their experience felt more real than the contents of everyday reality. So the fact that they were experiencing this content, it made a very big impression on them, and the yardstick of a mystical state just wasn't applicable. So eventually Strassman ended his research, and he kind of had a parting of ways with his Zen Buddhist community. And later he wrote another book called DMT and the Soul of Prophecy, where he basically takes the notion of prophecy in the Hebrew tradition and uses that as a way to talk about these religious experiences that people had on DMT, these visionary experiences with entities and this. So if you're interested in this, I think that's a very interesting book. So yeah, again, I'm just putting these quotes to show he's contrasting people had these experiences abundant in content versus completely void of content which they expected. And the majority of the work on psychedelics in academic philosophy also talks about this mystical type of experience, rather than the weird entity encounter or the magical or visionary experience. Now, I think there's many reasons for this. It might be relatively easier to discuss in some sense, because you don't have to get into discussions about the nature of the contents in that way. But it also has a historical precedent. So I'm going to talk about what I call esoteric maps of psychedelic consciousness. And basically the idea of psychedelic mysticism, which I would associate with the ideas of Aldous Huxley and Alan Watts. And in these books, you will find references to Huxley and Watts and quotations from Huxley and Watts, but not McKenna. So it's interesting that these two guys, their work is informing what people are talking about, but whether it's, as in the words of Strassman, is the yardstick really applicable for all psychedelic experiences, and particularly N N-DMT? So where did this come from? Well, in Doors of Perception, when Huxley has his mescaline experience, there's a particular part where he gets very afraid. And his wife says to him, would you be able to fix your attention on what the Tibetan Book of the Dead calls the clear light? And Huxley was doubtful. And she said, would it keep the evil away if you could hold it, or would you just not be able to hold it? And he considered the question, and he said, perhaps I could, but only if there was somebody there to tell me about the clear light. One couldn't do it by oneself. That's the point, I suppose, of the Tibetan ritual. Somebody sitting there all the time and telling you what's what. So at this point, we see Huxley, who had a background in comparative mysticism and wrote a very good book called A Perennial Philosophy, and he knew Eastern mysticism, but you can see that he's reaching to the models he has, right? And this is a really interesting idea of, well, what happens, how do I deal with a psychedelic experience? Will it help if I focus on this goal of meditation? And so he basically has come up with an esoteric interpretation of the Tibetan Book of the Dead as a way of using it as a practice for navigating psychedelic experiences, particularly difficult ones. Keep the evil away. So here we have this set and setting, the intention, fix your attention on the clear light, and the reminder is the person sitting there reminding the person about the clear light, because in that state it can be very hard to focus. And Tim Leary, Richard Alpert, and Ralph Metzner wrote this book, The Psychedelic Experience, a manual based on the Tibetan Book of the Dead, as a very deliberate, practical guide to basically implement what Huxley had suggested. Has anyone read this book? Has anyone done it, what it said? Yeah, okay, me too, yeah. It works, shockingly. So this is a fantastic book. I mean, I think this is really so interesting. They're very explicit about what the goal is. They're very explicit that this is just a model. The Tibetan model is designed to teach the person to direct and control awareness in such a way as to reach the level of understanding variously called liberation, illumination, or enlightenment. And so it has a very specific goal, not just a book, but it's saying there's a specific goal with your psychedelic experience, the mystical goal of transcending or attaining illumination or reaching enlightenment. And if we just take a look at the contents, I just find it so fascinating because it's so practical. You've got this like deliberate instructions for what to do. There's stuff, they're like dosages, planning a session, setting, preparation, then the different bardos that you will encounter or that, can happen and how to navigate them in specific readings or interpretations of the text that you use to deal with these visions. The goal is this period of ego loss to maintain that first bardo experience for as long as possible. But the techniques are for, if you go down to these lower ones, that you're able to find your way back up. It's very, very interesting work. I'm not going to say much more about that. If you're interested in knowing where that book came from, how it was written, who wrote it, who used it, this is a fantastic book, The Birth of a Psychedelic Culture. This book definitely influenced a lot of people. John Lennon read it and wrote Tomorrow Never Knows, kind of inspired by his experience. So what is it? I would say it's a practical manual of psychedelic mysticism. It's an esoteric interpretation of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. It's inspired by the doors of perception, and it introduces, in a very strong sense, this notion of set and setting for psychedelic experiences. And the primary goal of set and setting is attain more beneficial experiences and avoid harmful experiences. They explicitly say in the book, the drug doesn't produce the transcendent experience, it's just a chemical key. It opens the mind, it frees the nervous system of the ordinary patterns and structures, but the nature of the experience depends almost entirely on set and setting. So set refers to like an internal parameter, your mindset, your intention, your mood. So having a mystical or magical or religious intention or an esoteric aspiration, in other words, divine union or the philosopher's stone or accomplishing the great work, or in Aleister Crowley's language, the knowledge and conversation of the holy guardian angel. So you have an esoteric or mystical aspiration or goal or intention. And then the setting is external, it's the environment, the time, the place. And these are ceremonial or ritualistic reminders of the intention. That when you open your eyes or when something goes weird, you look down and something reminds you of what it is. It fulfills the function of what Huxley said, somebody reading the manual to you. So you can, the symbols of Kabbalah, alchemy, tarot, astrology, they could all be used as a way to reinforce this intention. Now, Leary, Albert, and Metzner were very clear about this is just a model, this is just a map, and different people draw different maps. And they expected other models to be written based on other manuals to be written based on different models. They in fact went on to do some themselves. Leary adapted the Tao Te Ching as a series of psychedelic prayers. Ralph Metzner wrote this really great book, Maps of Consciousness, which actually looks at lots of different maps of consciousness, including the I Ching, alchemy, I can't read what else is up there, tarot. So you can also see, if you go on Amazon today, you can buy any one of these books, which are also manuals for this psychedelic exploration, but they're all different models, right? They could be Hindu models, they could be Buddhist models, they could be a modern kind of scientific, medical influence model, let's say. So this idea of models, maps, I want to be very clear what I mean about this, okay? A map means something very specific. Here are two maps showing the same rough area of Dublin, okay? Now, which of these maps is true? Which? The left one's true. More true? Exactly. Because if I want to drive from Dublin city centre to the airport, that one's great. That one's not very useful. But if I want to know where the most people live in Dublin, that one's great. That one's not very useful. And so a map is not that it's true or false or right or wrong. It's just suitable for a purpose or not. And it depends what the intention is. Do you see? I'm sorry, it was a trick question, but thank you for answering. But do you see what I mean? And so this is why I wanted to sort of say that to make it clear that this isn't about is the mystical model right or better or the shamanic one. That's not the point. The point is, what is somebody trying to do? So a map is supposed to like hide some details and make other details visible. So I live in Prague. These are two maps of the metro in Prague. Which is the one that you want to be looking at when you're in a hurry to go to the airport? The one on the top. This is the one that you might want to know if you want to see where the relative locations of these are around the city. But they have different purposes. A map hides some things and reveals other things based on what the purpose is. A map is an abstraction or an interface, right? An abstraction or an interface is supposed to hide a complex reality behind something that's simple for you to engage with. We all have smartphones. That's a very, very complex piece of technology, but it's masked behind a very simple interface, just a black screen with touch buttons and icons. What's going on inside that is unbelievably complex by comparison. The microwave, you go to a microwave, and even I can use a microwave, right? I can really heat up a mean chicken tikka masala with a microwave. It's just simple buttons. But what's actually happening inside that machine when you press those buttons is very, very complex. So these are interfaces that allow us to engage with something in a specific way for a specific goal. And there are other maps of consciousness, not just this mystical unitive emphasis. Tribal psychedelic practices have a very different model. They even talk about the psychedelic substance or the plant in a very specific way. It's seen as a sacred medicine usually, or a religious sacrament. It's often itself worshipped as a deity. Or a plant teacher. Sometimes it's seen as a teacher. The plant has something to inform you about. The ceremonies have specific purposes, typically healing, divination, worship. They're usually group ceremonies. They have lots of music, sacred songs, prayers, and people experience ecstasy, vision, and sometimes even will report telepathy. Now, that's a very different thing than what we talked about with the psychedelic mysticism. And these spirit visions, these visions of non-human entities that offer spiritual guidance, this is a big part of plant shamanism. And the contact with these visions often inspires love, fear, awe. And even outside of a tribal context, the way these entities are interpreted basically depends on cultural context or the model that the person has. So peyote, you'll hear things like the white man goes into a church and talks about Jesus, but the Indian goes into a teepee and talks to Jesus. There's this relational conversation. Ayahuasca, this idea that every tree plant has a spirit. People say it has no mind, but I tell it it's that the plant is alive and conscious. There's a spirit in the plant that's conscious. It's the soul of the plant, its essence, it's what makes it alive. So, McKenna was very explicit about he's building maps, models, metaphors. He's not trying to say how it is, he's trying to describe ways for us to engage with this and to explain what it is that he's been experiencing. He says shamanism emphasizes the importance of making your own experience the centerpiece of any model of the world that you construct. So let's talk about McKenna on language, magic, and alien intelligence. So anyone who doesn't know who McKenna is, he's an American ethnobotanist, the kind of psychedelic bard of the 80s and 90s. He was very strong advocate of heroic doses of psilocybin, 5 dried grams of psilocybin mushrooms in silent darkness. I'm not really going to talk about McKenna and mushrooms. It's a different topic. I'm going to focus on McKenna and DMT today. And he was one of the people who really popularized DMT. It was a very niche underground thing, and McKenna went around talking about it. So, is McKenna a suitable subject for academic philosophy and for academic research? Because he had weird ideas like the stoned ape theory. He had some empirically false ideas that 2012 would be a kind of concrescent moment at the end of time. His form of delivering his ideas is kind of unconventional. These long lectures, uses a lot of idiosyncratic expressions, machine elves, and he's inspired by non-human intelligences like the DMT entities that he encountered on the mushrooms. Does that mean that he can't be studied in academia, or that if you're a philosophy student, you can't study this guy? Weird ideas in philosophy, 10 a penny. It's full of weird ideas. Empirically false ideas. Aristotle taught women had less teeth than men. No idea why. Never occurred to him to ask his wife to open her mouth and he could count. Unconventional form, arguably the greatest philosopher of all time, I'm going to say Plato, or Socrates, but Plato wrote dialogues. There's lots of different forms that philosophical discourse can take place. Idiosyncratic expressions. Have you read Hegel? Right? There's a lot of idiosyncratic philosophy out there. Non-human intelligences. Socrates claimed that he was inspired by a demon or a spirit that would guide him. Descartes said that it was a dream in which a kind of angel or an intelligence that kind of provoked his, shall we say, mathematical approach to the universe. So on none of these grounds could McKenna be discounted. If anyone is a student who wants to study McKenna, feel free to steal these arguments if your lecturer gives you any problems. And I also think McKenna has a unique psychedelic perspective. He engaged with psychedelic literature from about 14 years old. He was taking psychedelics since he was a teenager. He participated in the counterculture. He had multiple journeys to indigenous shamanic cultures, 4 decades of psychedelic experiences, 2 decades as a psychedelic public speaker. In contrast to Huxley and Watts, who encountered psychedelics very late in their lives and didn't have that engagement with shamanism. So I think there's a lot to be said for McKenna as a subject. He is a psychedelic philosopher in Lyon's terminology. He's a rationalist who's just had some very weird experiences, but he is a rationalist, right? In Lyon's terminology, he's engaging with these methods that unlock the unconscious thought processes, but he's using analytical methods to kind of explore those insights and make them sensible. He's an entheogenic esotericist. Hanegraaff even points out there's few people in the scene who are as well read in the traditional esoteric literature as McKenna. So, what McKenna said is we need a new myth, a new true story that tells us where we're going in the universe. And one of the key ideas for McKenna was the stoned ape theory, the idea that humans evolved from psilocybin mushroom-eating primates, and that this engagement with psilocybin offered primates an evolutionary advantage, or a set of evolutionary advantages. At low doses, it improved. It was a stimulant for hunting and gathering and improved their vision and their senses. But it also, at medium doses, caused like glossolalia and sort of spontaneous expressions. And he sort of theorizes that this was part of how language developed. And also then at high doses, they had visions and group ecstasy. And so this inspired the religious aspect of the primates. So I'm going to just read some quotes now from McKenna. He had this idea of the archaic revival, the secret fate of the 20th century. He called it a nostalgia for the archaic. nostalgia for the Paleolithic, and this is where body-piercing, abstract expressionism, surrealism, jazz, rock and roll, and catastrophe theory come from. The 20th century mind is nostalgic for the paradise that once existed on the mushroom-dotted plains of Africa, where the plant-human symbiosis occurred that pulled us out of the animal body and into the tool-using, culture-making, imagination-exploring creature that we are. The way out is back. The future is a forward escape into the past. This plant-human symbiosis is crucial in McKenna's thought. He sees the ego as a product of pathology. When psilocybin is regularly part of the human experience, the ego is suppressed, and suppression of the ego means defeat of the dominators, the materialists, and the product peddlers. Psychedelics return us to the inner worth of the self, to the importance of the feeling of immediate experience. What we discover through the psychedelic experience is that in the body, there are Niagaras of beauty, alien dimensions that are part of the self, the richest part of life. He sees psychedelics as agents of evolution, a catalyst to the human imagination, a catalyst for language. And for him, this is essential because what can't be said can't be created by the community. So we need this forced evolution of language. So what he wants to do is to go back to the agents that created language in the first place, the psychedelic plants, the Gaian logos, and the mysterious beckoning extraterrestrial minds beyond that brought humans into kind of contact with this. Hooking ourselves back up to the chakras of the hierarchy of nature and turning ourselves over to the mind of the total other that created us and brought us forth out of animal organization. So where did these ideas kind of come from? Well, they came in a large part from the experience at La Chorrera, which is what that book True Hallucinations is about, but I'm not going to discuss that. That was an experiment that him and his brother did in the jungle where they basically created an alchemical ritual and took huge amounts of psilocybin mushrooms for about 2 weeks and went absolutely bananas. And it's a really interesting story. But I'm going to stick to DMT here, and McKenna called DMT the convincer. When he was 19 years old, he was into Sartre, Camus, Marxism, Freud. I was a jerk. And after smoking DMT, he left all of that behind. And he realized all these people who say the universe is made of levels, who say there are discarnate intelligences, who say that death is not the yawning grave, he had dismissed them all. But in one experience, he was converted. Converted from naive rationalism, realism, reductionism to his present position, whatever it is. And he has this really interesting phrase, DMT shows you beyond a shadow of a doubt that the world is made of magic. So what happened in McKenna's DMT experience? Well, he said, self-dribbling basketballs or elf machines from hyperspace came forth and started communicating to him and speaking in a visible form of language and saying, do this, do what we're doing. Which is odd, to say the least, and not what he expected. And people do report not necessarily this, but similar kinds of transcendently weird experiences. And it seems to be about this evolution of language, this idea of evolution of language in McKenna's thought. These creatures, these entities want us to transform our language. And he says we need to transform our language because culture is created by language and our culture is toxic, murderous, and a downhill bummer. So we need to transform our language. And McKenna talks about this thing, the world is made of language, or the world is made of words. And he uses DNA as an example of this, or the chemical communication that takes place in a rainforest as an example of this. This idea, the real secret of magic is that the world is made of words. And he also says that the evolution of language will mean that kind of like intention will be made manifest, ambiguity or miscommunication will disappear in some sense, a kind of unambiguous language. And he points to like octopi who kind of transform themselves to communicate. They make visible what they are communicating. Or pheromones is another kind of notion of unambiguous language. And he wants to do this consciously. He says, we can move no faster than the evolution of our language. This is part of what psychedelics are about. They forced evolution of language. and no culture has ever consciously tried to evolve its language with the awareness that evolving language is evolving reality. There's this idea that language changes reality, and how we use language changes the universe, or at least changes our universe. Now, the weirdness of DMT seems to be a key thing for McKenna. He says it transcended any miracle I could ever ask for, because it not only had the quality of a miracle as I imagined it, but it had the quality of a miracle as I could not have imagined it. It was charged with the energy of the other. It had the ambiguity of a pun, a kind of zany, impossible, improbable, hysterical revelation of the joke. If flying saucers were to land on the south lawn of the White House tomorrow, it wouldn't change the fact that DMT is the weirdest thing in the universe. He says it's simultaneously so affirming and at the same time so paradigm shattering. Union with the white light you could handle. An invasion of your apartment by dual self-dribbling basketballs from hyperspace that are speaking in demotic Greek is not something you anticipated and could handle, right? So again, he's emphasizing this weirdness, right, in contrast to this classical mystical style experience. Sometimes people say, is DMT dangerous? It sounds so crazy. Is it dangerous? He says the only answer is if you fear death by astonishment. And then there's this notion of alien intelligence that for him, and this has been reported by many people, psilocybin and DMT trigger this contact-like phenomenon. And we have this notion again of this symbiotic relationship with a mystery, and that mystery is an intelligence. But let me be clear, when McKenna says alien intelligence, let's not mistake this for, this is not Grays, right, from the X-Files. He's means alien in this other, like a capital O. Something so bizarre that it actually masquerades as an extraterrestrial, so as not to alarm us, right? Something that's so weird, it pretends to be something from another planet, because what it really is something like the overmind of the species that's so different from primates, it's like a creature of pure information, made of language. This transcendent other, he says, it's a mystery wrapped in an enigma. There is no resolution. But there, as you get closer to the mystery, it communicates a series of analogical metaphors. And they're not suggested themselves. It's communicated to you by the other. So I'm going to quickly say something here. There's a lot of parallels here with Aleister Crowley's thought. I'm not going to mention that. But there's a lot of parallels between Leary's thought and Wilson's thought. They also talked about this transcendent other or weirdness and this language, and they also had this very interesting relationship with magic and language. And as an Irish person, I was kind of intrigued by the fact that they all are Irish American. So I kind of wondered what might be behind this. Now, they were all very interested in James Joyce. They all kind of identified as in this bardic tradition. McKenna even said, my innate Irish ability to rave had been turbocharged by years of psilocybin mushroom use. And there's also this notion of like Irish people being kind of rogues or rebels, right? And so we see Leary and Wilson here giving the sign of the Illuminati, or one of the signs of being in the Illuminati, right? This is what you do to authority that you don't like. And also, again, this Joyce. Joyce was a big influence on all of these guys. In fact, they all saw Joyce and Joyce's literature as kind of a precursor to psychedelics. They said reading Finnegan's Wake prepared them for the psychedelic experience. And there's also this Irish Celtic fairy faith that McKenna and Wilson are very interested in. McKenna wrote the introduction to an edition of this. So whether or not their interpretation of these kind of Celtic myths and fairy stories is kind of supported by the tradition is not the point. The point is it was in their head. It was part of their set. And Irish people stereotypically have a peculiarly intense relationship to intoxication and religion. And I always say this, like, a lot of people think that Irish people love drinking. I don't think that's true. Irish people love getting drunk. There's a difference, okay? So it's the intoxication itself, not just the process of drink. Anyone can drink. Tell me, intoxication. Irish people are very big on that, and on religion. So, and what's interesting is the religion of these guys would have been Catholicism. Now, I don't have very much good things to say about the Roman Catholic Church, but the Eucharist is a very interesting initiation that all three of those guys would have went through as kids. So I think that might be a part of it. This idea that you're going to commune with God or another through this. And they also probably were aware of, I know McKenna was aware of the kind of notion of a holy guardian angel in Catholicism. Now, if anyone, and as a contemporary example of this Irish interest in language, anti-authority, playfulness with language, a mixture of intoxication and religion, I would point to the band Kneecap. Any Kneecap fans here? Yeah, Carc galore. So, if anyone hasn't heard Kneecap or seen the movie, these guys are very explicit in their symbolism about ecstatic use of drugs. They refer to themselves as drug dealing pagans. There's a lot of mystical and magical language in their works. So, this is just to point out a kind of modern, contemporary alignment with this. I won't go into this, and if you need these translated, you can ask any of the Gaelgoers who might be in the room. But this is just to say that this isn't coming out of nowhere. It's interesting that these guys share a similar background. So let's contextualize McKenna, and I'll wrap it up ASAP. McKenna's entheogenic esotericism, he's very into Neoplatonism. He knows his Kabbalah, he knows Hermeticism, Gnosticism, alchemy, and ceremonial magic. But he's very interested in this Irish folklore, and he's massively involved in this plant shamanism. He went and encountered it, and he took it all together and made his own kind of practice out of it. But there's something very radical about McKenna that not many people, apart from McKenna, say. McKenna thinks nothing works but plants. McKenna doesn't think that the kind of thing that he's talking about can be done without psychedelic plants, right? Most people will say to you, these kinds of experiences, you can get them with other kind of methods. McKenna says the kind of thing he's talking about necessarily requires this plant-human symbiosis. He says there's no other way to do it. And people say, don't you think you ought to be able to do it by yourself? And he says, you can't do it by yourself. You must humble yourself to the point where you admit you can't do it unless you have the help from someone whose idea of home is a cow flop. Right? If you're willing to humble yourself to that degree, then you can get somewhere. And I think there's a lot to be said for this, because it would be weird if it was we were the only thing in the universe that we know of who's able to do anything completely independently of everything else in the universe, right? It seems from an evolutionary point of view to make sense that we would need something external to ourselves. So he has some theoretical concepts that he was equipped with, but he explicitly says you should have some techniques. He's got practices. He says you must invoke it. He speaks to the mushroom when he takes it. He engages with the entities when he sees them. He tests them, which is an idea strong in ceremonial magic. You don't just because the magic visionary snake tells you something doesn't mean it's true. You want to test that vision. And if you get into trouble, he says sing. That's the shamanic approach, sing. It oxygenates the blood, it gets oxygen flowing, and he says it calms you rather than, for example, like tensing up. He says it's much better to sing. If you're interested in this very esoteric approach to psychedelics and high doses of psychedelics, I strongly recommend checking out the work of Kalindi. Super interesting, very out there, but really inspirational stuff if you're interested in the combination of magic and psychedelics. So what is this thing that McKenna's doing with language? He's using this language to convey the utter mystery. He's trying to say this is stranger than we can suppose. That's why he uses these weird terms. This alien beauty is beyond description. It's utterly transcendent. It's paradigm shattering. It's the limit case of understanding. It's the experience of the impossible. In terms of Lyon's psychedelic space, for McKenna, DMT is this limit case of understanding. It's a maximally novel experience. It's always paradigm shattering and it's always beyond the imagination. And novelty is actually a big thing in McKenna's thought. He created a kind of metaphysics called novelty theory. This ineffable, he says, no matter how weird I say it is, no matter what scintillating metaphor I create to attempt to beguile you into imagining what you can't imagine, I'm aware that I'm falling short of the goal. I'm creating a symbol of what it is, but frankly, words fail. He knows that he can't communicate what it is. So what's he doing? He's using language to give us a weird experience. He's very inspired by James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake, and he actually reads Jabberwocky by Lewis Carroll. So when he talks about machine elves and dual self-dribbling basketballs and the transcendental object at the end of the time, he actually talks about Jabberwocky as an example of verbal intentionality and syntax overcoming the absence of inscribed meaning. In other words, because there's no conventional definition, it sort of does something to the imagination. It stretches the imagination. He's, the DMT entities were like saying, do this, trying to show a way of stretching the imagination. In terms of mind revelation, in Lyon's terminology, these were insights about language for McKenna and evolution. Specifically, the psychedelic plants had this role in evolution and will have this role and continue to have a role in evolution. So, just to also then touch on Alan Watts's and the psychedelic mysticism, you'll often hear this quote, if you get the message, hang up the phone. For psychedelic drugs are simply instruments like microscopes, telescopes, and telephones. The biologist doesn't sit with the eye permanently glued to the microscope. He goes away and works on what he has seen. Now, interestingly, it turns out this statement was taken from later editions. I think it makes sense, right? Because life is complex, right? So the chances are there might be more than one message, because there is a very important message that psychedelics can give you, which is that what you really are is something perfect and divine and eternal. And that's an important message, right? And it's important to know that. And you get the message and you go, I didn't know that. That's why I always feel shit, right? Then you know it. Great. But is that the only message? Because it's okay knowing that what you really are is something perfect and divine and eternal. But why do I still sometimes feel shit? You know what I mean? I would like a follow-up phone call to see if there's more information that I can get here, right? And even this analogy here breaks down. The biologist doesn't just go up to the microscope, look at it and go away and never go back to the microscope, right? So it makes sense that this was redacted, I think. And there are people who are taking this idea of an encounter with the other seriously. There's the Turingham Initiative that explore these entity encounters and are trying to kind of work out what it means. McKenna says there's a need for dialogue. And this is, I think, the key metaphor now for McKenna in what the psychedelic experience is and how to get value from it. The model for the psychedelic voyager is the fisherman, and the ideas that are brought back are the proof of the pudding. Now, interestingly, in Lyon's book as well, he also talks about this fisherman metaphor from David Lynch's book. David Lynch used the idea of being a fisherman for ideas as a way of explaining what creativity is. And I wonder if he knew of McKenna's work in this way, because Dr. Lawrence Jacoby from Twin Peaks is often said to be based on Terence McKenna. So what is this fishing metaphor? McKenna says we must go out onto the dark ocean of mind, let your nets down into the sea. But you're not looking for some behemoth that'll tear through your nets and foul them and drag you and your little boat into the abyss, nor are you looking for sardines that can slip through your net and disappear, like have you noticed that your little finger fits exactly inside your nostril, right? We want something better than that. We're looking for middle-sized ideas. They're not so small that they're trivial and not so large that they're incomprehensible. Middle-sized ideas that we can wrestle into our boat and take back to the folks on shore and have fish dinner. And that's what's important, the fish dinner. Because here's this distinction again between this mystical, almost solipsistic view versus the plant symbiosis. Because if spend nights on the empty ocean are beautiful, but if you return with empty nets, what have you done for your tribe? And if you go fishing and catch a lot of fish, but you eat them in the boat and come back with nothing but bones for the village, that's kind of bad behavior. For us, when we go into the psychedelic state, that's what we should be looking for, ideas. It's not for your elucidation. It's not part of your self-directed psychotherapy. You're an explorer. You represent our species. And the greatest good you can do is bring back a new idea, because our world is endangered by the absence of good ideas. Our world's in crisis because of the absence of consciousness. And solving the problems of the tribe is a form of evolution. So to whatever degree you can bring back a small piece of the picture and contribute it to the building of a new paradigm, then we participate in the redemption of the human spirit. And that's what it's really all about. So then we strip away all of the weirdness from McKenna's discourse. What is he saying? He sees psychedelics, particularly the tryptamines, as evolutionary agents. And he thinks that psychedelic mushrooms actually catalyze human evolution. And he thinks that the return to a symbiotic alliance with the psychedelic plants is essential, because this is what will help humanity to get guidance from non-human intelligences that are in the universe. Not supernatural, just some other form of intelligence that's not human. And in doing this, we'll willfully participate in our own evolution, because these psychedelic encounters with the radical other forces our language to evolve. And in doing so, hopefully, by having these kinds of experiences, we can bring back fish to feed the tribe. So thank you for your attention. I apologize for going over the 45 minutes, sorry. So does anyone have any questions? John.
Thanks so much. This was really, really great. We went into a lot of different alleyways, which I really appreciated. I want to ask your opinion about this concept of transformation with this idea of, because I've been hearing it a lot more lately, you know, people kind of trying to move away from like the spiritual aspect of entheogens, and they're trying to like maybe come up with a more secular definition of mysticism or mystical experience or thereof. So I've been hearing a lot of like, well, it's an experience that transforms you forever, or you know, some sort of a life-changing experience. And of course, I'm dealing a lot more with like really modern medieval antiquity or whatever. And I don't really see a whole lot of, I mean, there's some of it, you know, obviously Moses and the burning bush, yeah, okay, that was a transformation. But some of them aren't so transformative. And you know, somebody can do ayahuasca and, you know, and
yeah,
it could be a life-changing experience, and some of them might not be, you know, maybe you need a few more trips to Peru or whatever, you know, to effectuate. So I always have that trouble with that transformation as part of the definition, because it doesn't necessarily implies transformation. I want your opinion on this.
Okay, I think that's a brilliant point. And Emily and I were actually discussing something similar to this earlier. So let me just, firstly, I think actually it might be better to speak about it in terms of transformation, intentional. In other words, we can measure success if at the start I say there's something I want to achieve, like I want to come up with an idea for whatever, a talk, a movie, or I want to quit smoking cigarettes. And we can then measure whether or not that happened very easily, versus self-reported mystical experience. Oh, I had a transformation. I'm a much better person now. Right? So when people are so it's not enough to say, I had this transcendent experience in some sense, because we kind of don't care. We care, did you come out of it a better person, a better member of the community? Are you less harmful to yourself? And so on. And so I think the problem is not being precise enough about what specific transformations we want. And this is why I'm so interested in kind of models and set and setting, because there's where the very notion of getting into this stuff means you must have an intention that's clear. And I actually think what happens is when the intention is not clear, some other intention that is unconscious is what manifests. Because I've often heard people say, well, I don't want to prime the experience. I want it unconditioned. I want to see what it does on its own. But there's no unprimed, unconditioned experience, psychedelic or otherwise. So if I can I would say it's very troubling when somebody says, I was transformed, without following up with some very concrete, measurable thing. I quit cigarettes, I quit heroin, whatever it is. Would that answer it for you if somebody was able to say what the transformation was?
Not really. I'm just thinking about it more in a larger spectrum of like mystical experiences, not even like entheogens, because some people have like spontaneous mystical experiences where there's no intention, they just, they go to the Grand Canyon and see God, and or go to the desert, that's sort of like a classic sort of thing. So I know that you're talking about it more from like the entheogens perspective. I'm trying to see if I can stretch the band a little.
Yeah. Okay. So it still would come down to the question, like somebody goes to the Grand Canyon, has a spiritual experience, and they call it, it's that person saying it's a spiritual experience, or that person saying it's a transformation. When someone says it's a spiritual experience, that's difficult to weigh up, because we're just kind of taking their subjective report and lining it up with other subjective reports and seeing does it match. When someone says transformation, there's at least room there for you to go, there's some way we can measure whether there was a transformation or not. Whereas with the mystical or spiritual experience, it's just, are they saying the right words? If you know what I mean.
Are you saying that all transformative experiences have like some...
No, I'm saying that the word transform implies a change from A to B.
Yeah.
And therefore, did B really happen? Did the person quit smoking cigarettes or whatever? If somebody said I had a transformative experience, but I'm the same as I was, what does that mean? Is that?
Can I react to
Sure.
What you said in the first answer to this question, where you say that you need to prime kind of the experience, or like the intention of how you're going into the experience? But does that then not go against what you said before about needing to humble yourself in a way of knowing that you don't know, and maybe in that way you also don't know what you may need in that moment?
That's a great question. I would say that is part of your priming. Part of your priming is knowing that you kind of must surrender to it, and that you're not in control in that way. It's sort of like, almost like, let's say, a stoic view of going, I can only control myself and what I can prepare in myself. But I'm sorry, I don't mean to suggest that you control or you can predict the experience, but you can, just like if you went exploring up a mountain, there's a certain amount of preparation you can do, but there's a huge range of variables that can take place, right?
Yeah.
I would use that analogy. But I think that's a great question, right? Like, no, I would not. I'm not at all suggesting that you can like program it the exact way you want it to be or anything like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It won't. The intention for me never determines the outcome.
No,
No,
exactly. It's just like in fact, and that can change even during the experience. Yeah. But maybe to line up both of these things, part of the reason the language of transformation is stronger is because for therapy and medical experiments and for scientific work, you must have some measurable outcome. And so equally then, the treatments for whatever addiction and so on are programmed in a certain way, but I don't know the specifics, but I doubt they are presuming that it's going to dictate the experience, but it's about what that long process of doing the experience, going to the psychotherapy, doing the experience, reflecting on it, psychotherapy is about. That's a longer program.
Yeah.
But that's a great question.
I totally understand the benefit of doing it like that, but I'm also wary of containing these experiences within a secular or scientific
Yes, if I could.
model, because I believe that it like limits to the infinite possibilities it can make.
I believe we don't have to worry about that with psychedelics. They're not. The psychedelics will just break down any barriers that anyone tries to put up around them. I don't know, the mushrooms have their own agenda. They're fine. They don't need us to. Yeah.
If I may, just the instant summary that comes up in this conversation is a simple quote from the Rolling Stones, which can apply to both the scientific part and the medical part, which is you can't always get what you want, you get what you need.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where it comes down to. But if you make that measurable, then maybe it's replicable for some people.
Yeah. And I think, I guess what I'm advocating is preparation with the idea of maximize benefit, avoid harm. That's all. And that basically these like ancient esoteric traditions or tribal traditions, they exist for that reason. That's how they've survived. But yeah, I kind of agree with kind of everything saying. Oh, sorry, does I, yeah.
I wanted to maybe add, maybe it's like the integration afterwards that causes the transformation. So of course you can have like a vision, but if you integrate it into your life, that's what's changing you.
Yep.
Just the experience itself is just a nice show that you watch for.
Absolutely. And like, I think we're seeing that now, like the naive idea that all that has to be done is, just give the politician that you don't like the psychedelic and suddenly they'll become a loving, great person. The kinds of people who've been taking and talking about psychedelics in the past 10, 15 years, they don't all seem great, right? And they don't seem to be only beneficial transformation. So I think we're starting to see that these aren't just, we know now for sure, this isn't just a panacea. You don't just dose whatever, the Senate, and they're all gonna, turn into loving people or whatever, right? Which would, that was a serious kind of notion in the counterculture, right? So there's something else that needs to be part of this. It needs to be oriented by values in some sense. And that's what these maps or models are that I'm saying. They all have this implicit value in them. Whoever raises it the highest. Yeah.
So you briefly mentioned Kalindi, right?
Yeah.
Which, like you said, fascinating work. I think you did work with like these extremely high psilocybin mushroom doses, like 20, 30 grams, something like that. And in terms of the language you use, you must have been students of McKenna's, right? But I just wonder what you make, and I could be incorrect about this, like his more literal interpretation, I think, of like the realm of the insectoids.
Okay.
I don't think he was talking about archetypes or metaphor, right? But like, no, these insect surgeons actually exist. What do you make of that?
Okay, so a couple of things. One, I wouldn't say he was like a student of McKenna. There's like an interview, possibly with Eric Davis. I listened to an interview of him recently, and he talked about, he was part of a scene that were doing these high doses anyway. He knew of McKenna's work, but he was kind of doing it underground. And he talks about this was not completely unheard of. There were people doing it. And he was also combining it with African martial arts. That was also part of his training. I think if you took 20 dry grams of psilocybin, right, the idea that what you're encountering might be just archetypal is probably the last fucking thing on your mind, right? So I don't know if Kalindi, how literally he meant some of this to be. I saw him speak many times. I had a couple of conversations with him. He's super interesting. I also think he's using language in this way. I mean, he talks about superheroes. He talks about the Jedi and the Sith. He's using models to communicate with people. I think, again, like McKenna, Kalindi's very clear, like there's no way to describe what goes on in there. And he just goes, this is real magic. And this is like really, a whole other thing. This is not therapy. This is deep, serious spiritual exploration of different dimensions of the universe. But I wouldn't like to say one way or the other whether he meant it literally, how I would take it literally. I just love it. I mean, when I listen to him talk, I'm like, this is awesome. So if anyone hasn't heard Kalindi, check him out. Yes.
I was just wondering, you know, I was before that kind of similar question, but I was kind of wondering your opinion, or your opinion on what do you think the ontological status of these DMT entities are, or this hyperspace, or these ones that Kalindi was going into? What do you think?
What do I think?
What do you think the ontological status of it is?
I think my opinion does not matter, right? And I think that's a very, I like to remind myself of that as much as possible. I also sort of think, and this is kind of the answer to the previous question too, my engagement with esoteric practices and psychedelics also means that I'm not that worried about the ontological status of the experiences. I'm interested in what it does for me in my life. I don't expect anyone else to like take seriously anything I do or say because I think that an entity told me it. That might be what motivates me potentially, but that's my business. I think it only becomes really problematic. And you are right to ask about what somebody claims about the ontological status. If I come to you and say, you must do this because the magic snake told me that you should do it and you have to listen to that authority. I also think that these things are somehow fundamentally paradigm shattering. So it does seem like anytime somebody goes, aha, I got the ontological status worked out, an experience comes along and just shatters that. Those books that I put up, Cosmic Trigger by Robert Anton Wilson, I would suggest, if you haven't read that or heard of that, check that out. It's really interesting. Wilson basically says stuff like, you know, these entities maybe occupy something similar to the same ontological status as the square root of -1. In other words, it's not quite real, but it does something. It has some effect. But as it seems in my experience and the experience of other people I've talked to, they're real enough, you know.
In general, like a psychedelic experience, maybe like a non-dual experience, would you kind of go with the materialist paradigm that it's happening within the brain, or that is beyond that?
I'm only interested in. Okay. I think it's a brilliant question. For me, if you're asking my opinion, I'm interested in what I can do to make that happen more often for me with better benefits and less harm. And I've not seen any reason why the question of the ontological status would make it better or help me avoid harm more. I think it would lead to more confusion communication problems probably.
I guess to follow up on that, that I guess it becomes a problem for some people when they have a sort of a vested ontological paradigm that they believe in, and then they have a psychedelic experience that completely shatters that. They have like ontological shock.
Yes.
That then you need to cope with that, right? So then you need to either go towards some kind of radical agnosticism or adopt a new ontological model that will accommodate for your experience, right?
Yep.
And then do you have any suggestions for instance, what sources to consult or what models to look into that you have personally found to be inspiring or that you have seen people adopt with some efficiency?
I mean, for me, my main system of engagement is Aleister Crowley's system of magic and Thelema. Apparently it's not for everybody, but I love it. I think the model to adopt is something like radical agnosticism, utter skepticism, because maybe the lesson of ontological shock is we had unjustified ontological assumptions. And to then go, well, okay, let's get some new ontological assumptions and let's go back in. That might be a problem. And so to be in a situation where you're always able to kind of model switching seems to be the real thing. And again, that's sort of what I'm saying, because you switch your model according to your intention and so on. But yeah, these are amazing questions, by the way, I think.
She has a question.
Oh, you have a question?
Yes. So I was looking at the presentation. I come from Brazil, so I know DMT by my culture. So I was like quite wondering some stuff.
Okay.
So in the beginning, I was like, you guys were talking about psychedelic, and then I realized everything was most from the East, and I was like wondering, what is psychedelic for you guys? Like, DMT is inside of it, the mushrooms are inside of it, but would be like LSD also inside of those studies?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And mescaline. So DMT or the tryptamine, psilocybin, and mescaline are sometimes called the classical psychedelics, sometimes serotonergic psychedelics. I suspect there's many people in this room who are much better qualified to discuss this than me, but let's just... Now, the other thing is, I was using the word psychedelic in Lyon's terminology.
Yes, and then I realized it. So I realized that all the books, they're psychedelic, and then they were talking about Tibet and everything. It was like, it's not talking about like our entities or like our rituals, like of ayahuasca there. And then I was like, okay, it's not talking about DMT properly. But then I was wondering, and I don't know, maybe that's
So
I don't know if DMT is legal here.
okay, so no. I'm specifically speaking about like vaporized or smoked DMT crystal.
The crystal.
Yes, that's what McKenna is talking about, not ayahuasca. He did take ayahuasca. He does talk about it, but that's not what I was talking about. Sorry, I should have been explicit.
About crystals. Okay.
Yes, so I'm talking about McKenna's experiences of smoking DMT extract.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah. Which is qualitatively very different to ayahuasca. I've not experienced ayahuasca, but the people I know who've taken both have said this, and McKenna is also explicit about this. So thank you. I should have made that explicit.
To know. Okay. And then there was like so you guys quite see a little bit that could be like, because it was the part of intoxication. And actually for me, I am DMT, what I know more, it's ayahuasca of course, but DMT is like the disintoxication. We disintoxicate. And then I was like...
Yeah, that's what we say in Ireland as well.
But then here, and it's actually like what makes you, like for me culture, so then it's for us it's like what makes you stop with the others, like LSD and those kind of stuff, like is the is that, so it's like it's how you disintoxicate. So that was quite surprising for me. So here it can be seen that those experiences, like with DMT for example, is intoxication.
I'm using that word in a very particular way to just essentially mean like chemically perturbing consciousness, essentially. I mean, actually, it's a bad word, right? Because intoxication implies like poisoning in some sense. Yeah. Thanks. I should have been more clear.
And yeah, I think it was that. And then another question that is not about it, but also came in my mind. It was then, because I said, okay, in the beginning it was like a lot about the East religions, and then you have like the West esotericism, but the practice in the South would be like here in Europe known as...
Plant shamanism or, I mean, again, I'm probably not the best person to say but that's typically how people talk about tribal shamanism, something like this. Yeah. Okay. So you're right. I mean, and that's kind of McKenna's point. McKenna's point is the people who've been doing this for thousands of years in South America and Central America, these are the people who have the real picture of what's going on and what the power of this is, and the engagement with it as a plant teacher, and the engagement with it as something that brings you into contact with another intelligence. He's like, that's the best model. Okay. That's the classic model. And kind of this is sort of what I'm saying, this approaching it either with that Eastern mystical state or even the therapeutic or ontological assumptions of Western mechanical mind are very problematic when you go to these places. So yeah, I completely agree. Yeah. Do we have time? Yeah, no problem.
If there is maybe one final question?
Just about this idea that Terence McKenna would like the transcendental object in the end of time.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering, because it's something that it goes back to a lot of and like perhaps drawing a parallel between that and like what those people currently talk about, like the meter point or singularity. Like he talks about it often, not only in psychedelic terms, but also in technological terms. He's like, this is not a metaphor. Time is speeding up because time is the rate at which things happen. And our technology, the rate of information, is being passed at ever exponentially accelerating rate.
Mm-hmm.
And right now, in our culture, I think we're seeing this rate with our own eyes in ways that never before we've seen. Just the rate of news headlines that are being bombarded with us in a week would be enough to fill a decade or 50 years in a century. So I was wondering if you could kind of embody Terence's spirit and perhaps with this idea, and as Terence might do, perhaps connect it to almost like a mystical, kind of a prophetic sense of in almost every main religion, there is this endpoint. We are going towards somewhere. This somewhere is very specific. There are a lot of parallels between the religious description of it and the psychedelic or even technological description.
Okay, so there's a few things. First of all, I don't know, embody Terence McKenna. It sounds a lot like spiritualism. Okay, a couple of things. Robert Anton Wilson also talked about this acceleration of information speed. He called it the jumping Jesus phenomenon. He said, let's take all the information that was known in the world up to the time of Christ, and then look at how much of that information was then doubled, but in half of that time. And so he talks about how many Jesuses there have been, right? A Jesus being this unit of information. The idea of time speeding up, that's about our subjective experience of time more than time. Also the idea of there's something at the end or something at the beginning. I always find any metaphysics or cosmology that talks about the end point or talks about the start or only talks about the masculine or only talks about the feminine or only, right? Something's missing. Things don't seem to have that static, absolute. There's more like a dynamic. So you could basically you could look at the same sets of experiences and describe it in terms of something that starts at the beginning of time and moves to the end, or you could probably look at it and talk about something that is moving towards the point at the end of time. With McKenna and the transcendental object of the end of time, this occurred to me actually the other day, possibly after a little vape of DMT, but that when he is talking about the word object in that, I think if you want to get a sense of what is meant by that, think of it in the same sense of subject and object. In other words, in the mystical experience, this division between subject and object is transcended. In the revelation experience, the subject encounters an object, the transcendental object. And he's saying, at the end of time, that doesn't make sense. What can be at the end of time? End implies time. So you've got that, again, this zany improbability, right? A self-cancelling, right? So it's a limit case. It actually has this contradictory thing in it. And also in McKenna, this was why I wanted to emphasize, he's talking about evolution. So this transcendental object presents something that's constantly paradigm shattering and therefore forces evolution of language. That's what's impelling for us forward, because it keeps presenting something stranger than what went before, and so we have to adapt. You see, so I think that's sort of the gist of what's going on there. These encounters with the radical other in these psychedelic experiences forces us to improve our language to be able to conceptualize and communicate about that. And again, maybe, a large dose of DMT in a conversation with the other might be the best way to get the answer to that question. And with regard to all of the stuff about stuff that's in the news at the minute, I don't watch the news. I saw the only piece of news I needed to see in March 2020 when the Taoiseach came on the television and said, "We're shutting down the country, stay in your house." And I was like, oh my God, I'm not watching the news again. This is terrible. So yeah, that's all I have to say. So thank you very much.